In the spring of 1662, on a fortified island off the coast of China, two worlds collided in what would become one of the most dramatic sieges in Asian history. On one side stood the mighty Dutch East India Company, masters of global trade and colonial expansion, their cannons pointing seaward from the walls of Fort Zeelandia. On the other, a Chinese warlord with fire in his eyes and vengeance in his heart, leading 25,000 warriors across treacherous waters to claim what he believed was rightfully his. This is the story of Koxinga, the hero who crushed the Dutch and forever changed the fate of Taiwan. But to understand the fury that drove this remarkable man to risk everything in a desperate gamble for survival, we must first journey back to the chaos that consumed China in the middle of the 17th century. A world where empires crumbled, loyalties shifted like sand, and one man's refusal to bow would spark a legend that burns bright even today. The year was 1624, and in the bustling port of Hirado, Japan, a child was born who would grow to shake the foundations of two empires. His father, Zheng Zhilong, was a Chinese merchant who had risen from humble beginnings to command vast trading networks across the South China Sea. His mother, Tagawa Matsu, was Japanese, her gentle hands cradling a boy who would carry the blood of two nations in his veins. They named him Matsu, a Japanese name for a child who would spend his early years in the shadow of Mount Fuji, never knowing that destiny had already marked him for greatness. When the boy was 7, his father brought him across the water to Fujian province, where the ancient traditions of China awaited. Here, among the misty mountains and rice paddies of his ancestral homeland, Matsu became Zheng Chenggong, a brilliant student who devoured the classics and mastered the art of war with equal passion. His mind was sharp as a blade, his ambition boundless, and his loyalty to the Ming Dynasty absolute. But in 1644, the world Zheng Chenggong knew began to crumble. The great Ming Dynasty, which had ruled China for nearly 3 centuries, collapsed under the weight of rebellion and invasion. Peasant armies stormed Beijing. The emperor hanged himself from a tree in the Forbidden City, and from the north came the Manchu horsemen, their banners flying as they swept down to claim the Dragon Throne for their new Qing dynasty. For most, this was simply the changing of dynasties, as natural as the turning of seasons. But for Zheng Chenggong, it was betrayal of everything he held sacred. When the Longwu Emperor, one of the last Ming claimants, granted him the Imperial Surname Zhu in 1645, the young warrior felt the weight of heaven itself upon his shoulders. From that moment, he was no longer simply Zheng Chenggong. He was Koxinga, Lord of the Imperial Surname, and he would die before he allowed the Ming flame to be extinguished forever. His father, the pragmatic merchant Zheng Zhilong, watched the Manchu conquest with calculating eyes. When the new Qing rulers offered him power and position in their government, he saw opportunity where his son saw only dishonor. "The Ming are finished," he told Koxinga. "Join me, serve the Qing, and our family will prosper under the new dynasty." But Koxinga's response was like thunder across a clear sky. "I would rather die with honor than live in shame. The Ming raised me, educated me, and gave me purpose. I will not abandon them in their darkest hour." The break between father and son was complete, a wound that would never heal. But from that moment of defiance was born a legend. While the Qing consolidated their grip on mainland China, Koxinga retreated to the coastal islands of Xiamen and Jinmen, gathering around him the scattered remnants of Ming loyalty. Pirates and merchants, scholars and soldiers, all those who refused to bow to foreign rule found their way to his banner. For 12 years, he built his strength, his fleet growing until it dominated the waters of the South China Sea, his army swelling with men who shared his dream of restoration. The islands became his kingdom, a defiant outpost of Ming resistance in a world that had moved on. From here, his ships struck at Qing forces along the coast, disrupting their trade and keeping alive the hope that the Dragon Throne might yet return to Chinese hands. His name spread like wildfire through the coastal provinces, whispered in tea houses and sung in taverns, the story of the prince who would not surrender. But Koxinga was more than just a warrior. He was a visionary who understood that military might alone would not restore the Ming. He needed a secure base, a place where he could build not just an army, but a government worthy of the dynasty he served. In 1659, he made his boldest gamble yet, sailing up the Yangtze River with his entire fleet to assault Nanjing, the southern capital of China. The attack was a disaster. The Qing had learned to fear Koxinga's naval power, and they were ready. His ships were trapped in the river, his army cut to pieces, and the prince himself barely escaped with his life. The defeat shattered his reputation and scattered his forces. Worse still, the Qing now turned their full attention to his island strongholds, their armies pressing closer while their agents worked to cut off his trade routes and turn his allies against him. As 1660 drew to a close, Koxinga faced the darkest moment of his life. His treasury was empty, his soldiers hungry, and his dream of restoration seemed further away than ever. The Qing offered pardons to those who would surrender, and many of his followers were tempted. The great prince of the sea was running out of options, his back pressed against the wall by an enemy that seemed impossible to defeat. Then, in the depths of his despair, hope arrived in an unexpected form. A Chinese man named He Bin, who had been working for the Dutch East India Company on the island of Taiwan, fled to Koxinga's base with a gift that would change everything. In his hands was a map, carefully drawn and annotated with the positions of every fort, every garrison, every weakness of the Dutch colonial administration. Taiwan, He Bin whispered, was ripe for the taking. The island of Formosa, as the Portuguese had named it, meaning beautiful, had been under Dutch control for nearly 4 decades. The Dutch East India Company had built their fortress of Zeelandia on its western shore, a massive stone structure that commanded the harbor and protected their profitable trade with China and Japan. From this base, they controlled the western plains of the island, extracting tribute from the native tribes and growing rich from the sugar and rice that flowed through their warehouses. But as Koxinga studied He Bin's intelligence, he began to see opportunity where others saw only Dutch strength. The fortress was indeed mighty, but it was far from home, dependent on supply ships that crossed thousands of miles of ocean. The garrison was professional but small, fewer than 1,000 soldiers to hold an island the size of a kingdom. Most importantly, the Dutch had grown comfortable in their prosperity, confident that no Chinese force could challenge their dominance of the sea. They were about to learn how wrong they were. As winter turned to spring in 1661, Koxinga began preparing for the most audacious campaign of his career. He would not simply raid Taiwan and withdraw, as he had done to other Dutch positions. He would conquer it completely, making it the foundation of a new Ming kingdom beyond the reach of Qing armies. In the harbors of Xiamen and Jinmen, hundreds of junks gathered like storm clouds on the horizon. Carpenters worked day and night to repair hulls and replace masts, while armorsmiths forged weapons for the thousands of warriors who flocked to Koxinga's banner. The prince himself moved among his men, his presence alone worth a dozen speeches, his determination infectious as a fever. The preparations were unlike anything the South China Sea had ever witnessed. In the shipyards of Xiamen, the sound of hammers rang like war drums as craftsmen transformed fishing vessels into instruments of conquest. Koxinga spared no expense, pouring the last of his treasury into provisions, weapons, and the massive undertaking of moving an entire army across hostile waters. His admirals warned him that the venture was madness, that the Dutch fleet would destroy them before they could even reach Taiwan's shores. But Koxinga had studied his enemy well. The Dutch were masters of the open ocean, their heavy warships bristling with bronze cannons that could sink a junk with a single broadside. Yet they were few in number, and their ships were built for deep-water warfare, not the shallow coastal fighting where Chinese vessels excelled. More importantly, they had grown lazy in their dominance, their patrols predictable, their vigilance dulled by decades of unchallenged rule. On the 23rd of March, 1661, the moment of truth arrived. As dawn broke over the harbor of Kinmen, the largest invasion fleet in Chinese history began to move. Hundreds of junks filled the water from horizon to horizon, their red sails catching the morning light like drops of blood on silk. At their head sailed Koxinga's flagship, its dragon figurehead carved with such fierce detail that it seemed ready to breathe fire upon his enemies. 25,000 warriors crowded the decks, their armor glinting in the sun, their spears and swords ready for battle. These were not the desperate pirates and bandits his enemies claimed them to be. They were the flower of southern China, men who had chosen exile over submission, who would follow their prince into hell itself if he commanded it. Among them were Ming scholars who had abandoned their books for blades, merchants who had traded silk for steel, and farmers who had left their fields to reclaim their honor. The fleet made first landfall at Penghu, the wind-swept islands that guarded the approaches to Taiwan. Here, Koxinga established a forward base, leaving a small garrison to secure his line of retreat, while the main force pressed on toward their ultimate prize. The Dutch had watchers on Penghu, but they fled at the first sight of the Chinese armada, racing to warn their masters that the storm they had long feared was finally upon them. 2 days later, on the 2nd of April, the invasion fleet appeared off the coast of Taiwan like a vision from a nightmare. The Dutch had expected raids, perhaps a few dozen pirate junks seeking easy plunder. Instead, they found themselves facing an armada that darkened the sea, its banners flying the ancient symbols of the Ming Dynasty. Fort Zeelandia's lookouts could barely believe their eyes as ship after ship appeared on the horizon, more vessels than they had ever seen in one place. Inside the fortress, Governor Frederick Coyet received the news with growing alarm. A veteran administrator who had served the company faithfully for decades, he had dealt with Chinese pirates before, but this was something entirely different. The intelligence report spoke of Koxinga himself leading the attack, the legendary sea prince whose very name struck fear into Qing hearts. Worse still, the garrison was undermanned, many soldiers having been sent to other Dutch possessions, leaving fewer than 1,000 men to hold the most important fortress in the Indies. Coyet immediately dispatched urgent messages to Batavia, pleading for reinforcements and supplies. But help was weeks away at best, and the Chinese fleet was anchoring in the bay even as his messengers raced toward their ships. The governor gathered his officers in the fortress's great hall, the massive stone wall seeming suddenly thin against the force gathering outside their gates. The Dutch had one advantage that gave them hope. Their warships were anchored in the harbor, 3 vessels of the line armed with the finest cannons in the world. The Hector, their flagship, mounted 50 guns and had never known defeat in battle. Surely these Chinese junks, however numerous, could not stand against European firepower and seamanship. Admiral Pedel, commander of the small Dutch fleet, was confident that a single coordinated attack would scatter the invaders like leaves before a hurricane. But Koxinga had not come this far to be turned back by Dutch arrogance. As his fleet approached the harbor, he deployed a strategy that caught his enemies completely off guard. Instead of sailing directly into the guns of the waiting warships, he divided his force, sending the bulk of his fleet through shallow channels that the Dutch had dismissed as impassable for large vessels. His pilots knew these waters intimately, guided by fishermen and traders who had sailed these coasts for generations. The maneuver was brilliant in its simplicity. While the Dutch fleet waited in the deep channel, expecting a frontal assault, Koxinga's main force slipped through the shallows like shadows, emerging behind the enemy position before they could react. The 3 Dutch warships found themselves surrounded, cut off from the fortress they had come to protect, facing enemies on all sides. Admiral Pedel ordered an immediate attack, his ships turning to bring their broadsides to bear on the nearest Chinese vessels. The thunder of cannon fire rolled across the water as bronze guns spoke in unison, their iron shot smashing through junk hulls and sending splinters flying like deadly rain. For a moment, it seemed the Dutch might fight their way clear, their superior firepower carving gaps in the Chinese formation. Then disaster struck with the suddenness of lightning. A Chinese fireship, its hull packed with explosives and its crew already fled, drifted against the Hector's side. The Dutch sailors tried desperately to push it away, but the fuses were already lit, the flames racing toward barrels of gunpowder stored in the warship's magazine. The explosion, when it came, was heard 50 miles away, a pillar of fire and smoke that marked the death of Dutch naval supremacy in Taiwan waters. The remaining 2 ships, a yacht and a smaller warship, found themselves hopelessly outnumbered and outmaneuvered. Their captains fought bravely, but courage could not overcome mathematics. One by one, Chinese fireships and boarding parties overwhelmed the surviving vessels, their crews either killed in battle or taken prisoner to serve as bargaining chips in the siege to come. With the harbor secured, Koxinga's army poured ashore in wave after wave of disciplined formations. The Dutch had prepared defenses on the beaches, earthworks and gun positions designed to turn the landing into a slaughter. But the Chinese prince had studied European military manuals as carefully as he had studied the classics, and he knew how to adapt their tactics to his own purposes. Instead of charging directly into the prepared killing grounds, Koxinga's forces landed at multiple points simultaneously, stretching the Dutch defenses thin while concentrating overwhelming force at key positions. His veterans, hardened by years of fighting both Qing armies and rival warlords, moved with the precision of clockwork, each unit knowing its role in the greater plan. The first Dutch counterattack came at dawn, General Pedel leading his men out of the fortress in a desperate attempt to drive the invaders back into the sea. The European soldiers advanced in perfect formation, their muskets loaded and bayonets fixed, confident that discipline and firepower would carry the day. They had defeated larger Chinese forces before, scattering Ming loyalists with volleys of lead and steel. But these were not the desperate rebels they had faced in previous campaigns. Koxinga's warriors met them with a wall of shields and spears that seemed to stretch from horizon to horizon, their ranks so deep that each fallen man was immediately replaced by another. The Dutch muskets fired in disciplined volleys, their bullets finding targets in the front ranks, but still the Chinese line held firm. Then came the moment that shattered Dutch confidence forever. As Pedel's men paused to reload their weapons, Koxinga's cavalry burst from concealment on both flanks, their horses pounding across the sand like thunder incarnate. The Europeans found themselves surrounded, their neat formations dissolving into chaos as Chinese sabers rose and fell like harvesting scythes. General Pedel himself fell in that first terrible charge, his body pierced by a dozen wounds as he tried to rally his men for one last stand. The surviving Dutch soldiers fled back toward the fortress, leaving the field littered with their dead and wounded. Behind them came Koxinga's army, their victory cries echoing across the island as they surged toward the walls of Fort Zeelandia. The siege of Taiwan had begun, and already the Dutch were learning that they faced an enemy unlike any they had encountered before. This was not a mere pirate raid or a desperate gamble by a defeated warlord. This was the calculated assault of a master strategist who had turned the art of war into a science, who understood that victory belonged not to the bravest or the strongest, but to those who could adapt, evolve, and refuse to accept defeat. As the dust settled from that first devastating defeat, Governor Coyette stood atop the battlements of Fort Zeelandia, watching the Chinese banners advance across the plain like a crimson tide. The fortress that had once seemed so mighty now felt like a stone island in an ocean of enemies, its walls suddenly fragile against the force that surrounded them. Below in the courtyard, wounded Dutch soldiers stumbled through the gates, their faces pale with shock and their voices hoarse from shouting warnings that had come too late. The governor was a practical man who had built his career on calculating odds and managing risk. As he surveyed the forces arrayed against him, the mathematics were brutally simple. 900 soldiers against 25,000. One fortress against an entire army. Supplies for perhaps 6 months against an enemy who controlled the seas and could wait as long as necessary. Yet Frederick Coyette was also a company man, trained never to surrender what could be held, and Fort Zeelandia had been designed to withstand exactly this kind of assault. The fortress was a marvel of military engineering, its massive stone walls rising 40 feet above the harbor, its bastions angled to provide overlapping fields of fire against any attacker. Within those walls lay warehouses packed with trade goods, armories filled with muskets and powder, and cisterns that could sustain the garrison through months of siege. Most importantly, the fort commanded the harbor entrance, its cannons capable of sinking any ship that dared approach without permission. But as Koxinga's forces established their siege lines, Coyette began to understand that his enemy was no ordinary warlord. The Chinese prince deployed his troops with the precision of a chess master, each unit positioned to serve a specific purpose in the grand strategy. Artillery batteries sprouted along the shoreline like deadly flowers, their bronze barrels trained on the fortress walls. Infantry camps spread across the island in perfect geometric patterns, their cooking fires twinkling like stars in the gathering dusk. Within days, the siege had taken on the character of a second city, one built entirely for the purpose of conquest. Koxinga established his headquarters in a captured Dutch administrative building, its rooms filled with maps and intelligence reports as he studied every detail of his. His enemy's position engineers, many of them former Ming military officers, began the methodical work of reducing the fortress through scientific siege warfare. The first parallel trenches appeared within a week, zigzagging lines of earth that crept steadily closer to the fortress walls. Dutch cannons thundered from the ramparts, sending iron balls screaming toward the Chinese positions, but for every trench section destroyed, 2 more appeared overnight. Koxinga's men worked with the patience of farmers, understanding that time was their greatest weapon in this contest of wills. Governor Coyette watched this methodical approach with growing unease. He had expected wild charges and desperate assaults, the kind of reckless attacks that European firepower could easily repel. Instead, he faced an enemy who seemed to understand siege warfare better than many European generals, who advanced by inches rather than yards and accepted casualties as the necessary price of victory. The psychological pressure was as devastating as the physical siege. Each morning brought fresh evidence of Chinese preparations, new gun positions, and approach trenches that had appeared in the darkness like manifestations of some terrible dream. The Dutch soldiers on the walls began to mutter among themselves, their confidence eroded by the sheer scale of the forces arrayed against them. More troubling still were the reports from the island's interior. The Aboriginal tribes, who had served as allies and trading partners for decades, were abandoning their Dutch connections and flocking to Koxinga's banner. Village chiefs who had once brought tribute to the fortress now sent their warriors to join the Chinese army, their loyalty purchased with promises of freedom from colonial taxation and forced conversion to Christianity. The defection of the Sincan tribe was particularly devastating. These warriors had helped the Dutch suppress Chinese rebellions in the past, their knowledge of the island's hidden paths and secret harbors invaluable to colonial security. Now they turned that same knowledge against their former masters, guiding Chinese patrols to Dutch outposts and revealing the locations of supply caches and ammunition dumps. As spring turned to summer, the siege tightened like a noose around the fortress. Chinese batteries began a systematic bombardment of the walls, their cannons firing in carefully timed sequences designed to prevent the defenders from repairing damage between assaults. Each day brought fresh craters in the stone, new gaps that had to be plugged with sandbags and debris, while enemy marksmen picked off anyone who showed themselves above the parapets. The supply situation grew critical as the weeks passed. Fort Zeelandia had been designed to withstand a siege, but its planners had never imagined facing an enemy who could completely control the surrounding waters. Chinese junks patrolled every approach to the harbor, their crews alert for any vessel that might attempt to bring relief to the beleaguered garrison. The fortress's cisterns still held water, but food was becoming scarce, and ammunition was being expended faster than anyone had anticipated. Governor Coyette dispatched increasingly desperate messages to Batavia, pleading for immediate reinforcement and relief. But the distances were vast, and the company's other possessions also required protection. The nearest substantial Dutch force was thousands of miles away, and even if they sailed immediately, they could not arrive for months. The fortress would have to hold out on its own, or not at all. Inside the walls, discipline began to fray as the reality of their situation became clear. Dutch soldiers who had once swaggered through Asian ports now huddled in the fortress's corridors, their nerves shattered by the constant bombardment and the knowledge that they were utterly alone. Some began to whisper of surrender, arguing that the company would not blame them for yielding to impossible odds. But Governor Coyette refused to consider capitulation. His orders were clear: hold Taiwan at all costs, maintain Dutch control of this vital link in the company's trading empire. More than duty drove his determination. He knew that surrender to a Chinese warlord would mean the end of his career, disgrace that would follow him to his grave. Better to die on the walls than live as the man who lost Taiwan. So ended the siege that shattered Dutch dreams and forged a new destiny for Taiwan. Koxinga's triumph proved that courage, strategy, and unwavering determination could overcome even the mightiest colonial powers. Though his kingdom lasted only decades, his defiant stand echoes through history as proof that sometimes one man's refusal to surrender can change the world forever. In the end, Koxinga's conquest of Taiwan stands as one of history's most remarkable reversals of fortune, a testament to the power of unwavering determination in the face of impossible odds. The Dutch East India Company, masters of global commerce and colonial expansion, found themselves humbled by a Chinese prince who refused to accept defeat even when his world crumbled around him. What began as a desperate gamble by a warlord with his back against the wall became a masterpiece of military strategy that echoed across centuries. The hero who crushed the Dutch was more than just a brilliant commander. He was a man caught between two worlds, carrying Japanese blood and Chinese loyalty, fighting for a dynasty that existed only in memory and dreams. His victory at Taiwan proved that the age of European dominance was not inevitable, that Asian powers could adapt, evolve, and triumph when led by visionaries willing to risk everything for their beliefs. Though Koxinga's kingdom would eventually fall and Taiwan would see many more masters, his legacy burns bright in the island's history. He showed that sometimes the greatest victories come not from accepting the world as it is, but from refusing to surrender to what others claim is fate. In an age when empires seemed eternal and defeat appeared final, one man's defiance changed everything. The prince who would not bow had spoken, and the world would never be the same.